The town of Ravens Hollow was not much of a town at all, just a crooked line of wooden buildings, leaning against the wind as if they might collapse at any moment. Dust crawled through every gap, whistling through the empty saloon doors, coating the cracked windows of the general store, and clinging to the church bell that had not rung in years. By noon, the sun pressed down like a hammer, bleaching the earth until it seemed nothing could grow there. Yet, despite the suffocating heat and the gnawing emptiness, the townsfolk had gathered on the main street, pulled like flies to a carcass. They didn't gather for celebration, nor for trade, nor even for justice. They gathered to see children sold. 3 of them stood on a crude platform, their bare feet caked in mud, their arms bound with coarse rope. Each one wore a burlap sack over the head, rough, filthy, and pulled tight around their necks, so not a single face could be seen. The sacks made them look less like children, more like objects stripped of all humanity, reduced to silhouettes against the burning sky. The auctioneer, a bloated man with skin red as raw meat from years of whiskey and sun, lifted his hands high. His voice carried sharp through the air. 3 orphans! Strong enough for field work, quick enough for house chores. Who'll take them? Who'll put coin on the table? Some men laughed, shifting uncomfortably in the heat. A few spat tobacco juice into the dirt, muttering about the waste of silver on mouths that did not yet know labor. Women whispered behind gloved hands, shaking their heads but never looking away. The children did not move. They stood silent, shoulders slumped, sacks rising and falling with uneven breaths. For a moment, no one bid. Then the sound of footsteps cut through the silence. From the far end of the street, she came, a widow. Her figure was lean, draped in a black dress worn pale at the seams. A thin veil shaded her face, though beneath it her eyes were steady and unflinching. She carried no smile, no expression, only a stillness that unsettled those who dared look too long. Her boots pressed slow against the earth, each step deliberate, echoing louder than the auctioneer's voice. The crowd shifted uneasily as she passed. Men who had faced pistols without flinching found their throats dry. Women who had buried children of their own felt a chill despite the heat. No one spoke her name aloud, though everyone knew it. They called her the lonely widow. Her husband had died years ago, and not quietly. The story traveled in whispers. He had been gunned down, dragged home by her own hands, his blood staining her black dress until it could never be washed out. From that day forward she withdrew from town, retreating to her isolated land where no visitors came, where no laughter echoed, where even the crows avoided circling too long. And now, here she was, standing before 3 faceless children, her presence turning the jeers of the crowd into silence. The auctioneer cleared his throat, sweat shining across his forehead. "Widow," he muttered, "these ain't no good company for a lady like yourself. Best let someone else—" She raised a hand, silencing him. The motion was small, but it carried the weight of finality. She did not ask their ages. She did not ask what families they once belonged to. She did not even ask that the sacks be removed. Instead, she reached into her satchel, withdrew a small leather purse, and placed it on the platform. The sound of coins clinking was heavier than a gunshot. "I'll take them," she said. Her voice was low, steady, and without tremor. The crowd gasped, murmurs rolling like thunder. Why buy 3 children she had never seen? Why trust what lay beneath those sacks of burlap? The auctioneer hesitated, shifting his gaze from her to the children and back again. But there was no refusing her, not because of her silver, but because no one dared defy the widow's will. The rope bindings were cut. The 3 orphans shuffled down the platform, heads still covered, hands trembling at their sides. They followed her as if bound still by invisible chains, their small shadows stretching thin behind her in the dust. The widow turned without another word. Her veil lifted slightly in the hot wind as she led them down the long road out of town. And as she disappeared into the horizon, the crowd remained, uneasy and restless, the question heavy on their tongues. What kind of woman buys 3 children she refuses to even see? 99.4% of you watching aren't subscribed yet. Only 0.5% have joined the ride. Don't miss out. Hit subscribe and become part of the story. The path out of Ravens Hollow stretched long and merciless beneath the sun. The widow walked ahead, her black veil fluttering faintly in the hot wind. Behind her, the 3 children followed in silence, their heads still covered with the burlap sacks, their bare feet dragging through the dirt. The sound of their steps was uneven, light, fragile, uncertain. No one spoke. The town's noise had already faded, swallowed by the open land. Out here, only the dry grass whispered and the distant crows called. The widow's boots pressed forward without hesitation, every step as sure as if she had walked this road 1,000 times before. The children stumbled often, but she never looked back, never slowed, as though she knew they would follow no matter what. The sun dipped lower, bleeding orange across the horizon, when at last her home came into view. It was less a home and more a shadow, an old farmhouse standing crooked at the edge of a dying field. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving grey wood splintered by years of storms. Fences leaned and sagged, patched together by rusted nails. The well sat dry, covered by a warped plank. Even the barn had caved in on itself, like a carcass left too long in the dirt. This was where she lived. This was where she had brought them. The children paused when they saw it, their sacks swaying slightly in the wind. One of them shifted his weight as though ready to turn and run. But the widow raised her hand again, the same silent gesture that had stilled the auctioneer, and they obeyed. Step after step, they crossed the threshold into her land, as though pulled into her orbit by something unseen. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and old grief. Dust coated the shelves, where a Bible lay open but untouched, its pages yellowed and curled. The furniture was sparse, a table with 3 chairs, though one had been broken and pushed aside, a rocking chair that creaked softly in the draught, a hearth with embers glowing faint red, as if the fire had been kept alive only out of duty. The widow moved through the rooms with a practiced rhythm, setting out plates though no one had yet spoken of food. She ladled thin stew into bowls, steam rising faintly, then gestured for them to sit. The children obeyed. Still wearing the sacks, they fumbled awkwardly with their spoons, raising them to where their mouths should be. The burlap grew wet, stained by broth, but they ate without complaint, without a word. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons and the hollow whistle of wind through the cracks in the house. The widow sat across from them, untouched food before her, watching. Her hands rested still on the table, her veil casting shadow across her face. Her eyes never left the children. She studied their trembling hands, the curve of their shoulders, the quiet rhythm of their breathing. She said nothing. When the bowls were empty, she gathered them in silence, stacked them neatly, and set them by the hearth. Then, with a single nod, she gestured for the children to rise. They followed her to a small side room, a space bare except for straw mats laid across the floor. She pointed, and they lay down, curling like stray animals in a corner. The widow lingered in the doorway, watching as they shifted, as they tried to rest beneath the sacks that still covered their faces. For a long while she did not move. Only when their breathing steadied into shallow sleep did she turn away. That night, the house felt different. The widow sat in her rocking chair by the cold hearth, her veil set aside at last. Her face, pale and drawn, was marked not by weakness but by years of solitude. Lines carved by sleepless nights traced her skin, though her eyes, dark, sharp, unyielding, burned with something the town had never understood. Outside, the wind clawed at the shutters. Inside she listened, every creak of the floorboards, every shift of straw beneath the children, every muffled sigh against the burlap sacks. The presence of 3 strangers in her house filled the silence she had lived with for years. Yet it did not bring comfort. It brought weight, a weight she did not name, could not shake. Hours passed, midnight came, and then, faintly, almost swallowed by the dark, she heard it. A whisper, not a cry, not a plea, but a whisper soft as breath itself. One of the children, speaking through the sack, had said something. She froze, rocking chair stilling, her hands tightening on the worn wood. The whisper had not been a prayer. It had not been a sob, it had been a word, her name. The sound of that whisper clung to the widow like smoke. She had heard many things in the dead of night, Coyotes howling from the hills, the creak of her own rocking chair, the restless groan of wood swollen with age. But this was different. It was her name, spoken softly, from a child who should have known nothing of her. For long minutes, she did not move. The chair beneath her was frozen mid-rock. The fire in the hearth had collapsed into ash, and the house seemed to hold its breath along with her. Finally, she rose. Her steps carried her to the small room where the children lay. The doorframe seemed to pull her forward and resist her all at once. She stood there in silence, a shadow among shadows, her breath shallow in her chest. 3 small forms lay across the straw mats, sacks still drawn tight over their heads. The faint smell of burlap and sweat hung heavy in the air. The children shifted faintly, their bodies restless in sleep, but one was awake. She could tell by the way he breathed. Too quick, too shallow? The sack over his head moved with each nervous inhale. He knew she was there. He knew she had heard. The widow stepped closer. The floorboards moaned under her weight, and the other 2 stirred but did not rise. She stopped over the one who had whispered. Her shadow fell across him, long and sharp beneath the pale light leaking through the cracked window. Slowly, with a hand steady from years of burying grief, she reached down. Her fingers brushed the edge of the sack. The boy flinched. But he did not resist. She pulled it back. The burlap peeled away with a dry rasp, and the face beneath was revealed. Dirty skin streaked with dust, eyes too large for such a thin frame, glimmering in the dark, lips trembling, yet curved in the faintest echo of recognition. He spoke again, his voice cracked and hoarse. "I know you." The widow's breath caught, but her face betrayed nothing. She waited, silent, immovable, though every muscle in her body screamed. The boy licked his lips, his voice shaking as he continued. "Your name. My father said it. He told us about you." Her heart stilled. "Father." The word struck her like a bullet. The boy's gaze darted to the floor as though ashamed. He said, "You were the woman who betrayed him." The widow's hands clenched into fists at her side. Her voice, when it came, was low and edged like a blade. "Your father's name." The boy swallowed hard, his thin chest rising and falling as though every breath hurt. "Elias," the room tilted. The walls seemed to shrink, pressing her into a past she had buried deep. Elias, a name that tasted of gunpowder and ash. A name she had not heard in years, a name she had sworn never to let touch her ears again. The widow turned sharply, her veil slipping from her hair as she paced back into the dim hallway. Her boots struck the floor like gunshots. Memories rose unbidden, fierce and merciless. Elias, her husband's brother. The man who had once sworn loyalty, then spit on it. The man who had brought ruin to her land, who had stolen what wasn't his, who had left blood spilled across her doorstep. And now, these children. His blood. She pressed her palms against the rough wood of the wall, her body trembling though her face remained carved of stone. How could they be here? Why had they been left to the market like livestock? The widow turned, walking back into the room where the children huddled. The boy whose sack she had pulled away sat trembling, the other 2 still bound in burlap, unaware of the storm breaking around them. Her eyes burned into his. "You speak my name once more," she said coldly, "and you will choke on it." The boy nodded quickly, tears streaking dirt across his cheeks. Yet even through fear, his voice carried something heavier than terror. "Something closer to hope," he told us. "You were the only one who could keep us safe." The widow froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The walls of the house seemed to press closer, the silence deeper than ever. Safe. The word twisted through her chest like a knife. She had lived years believing her life had ended with her husband's blood in the dirt. She had thought no one would ever speak her name again. Yet here, in her crumbling house, 3 children bore the ghost of her past, and one of them believed she was their salvation. The widow stepped back into the shadows of the doorway. Her hands trembled at her sides, though she forced them still. Her eyes narrowed, voice sharp as steel drawn from its sheath. "Sleep," she commanded. The boy lowered his gaze, pulling the sack back over his head like a penance. He lay down again, curling small against the straw, his shoulders shaking with every breath. The widow stood there long after they had gone quiet. The house seemed to breathe with her, each creak of wood echoing in the hollow of her chest. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rumbled. By dawn, nothing would be the same. The storm arrived at dawn. Not a storm of rain nor of thunder, but of memory. The widow woke to silence heavy enough to smother her breath. The house was still, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and smoke. She sat up in her chair, bones aching, eyes hollow from a night without sleep. Her gaze drifted to the closed door where the children lay, and her chest tightened. They were not just children. They were blood, not hers, but his. She rose, slow and deliberate, and walked to the small chest kept at the end of the hallway. Her fingers hesitated over the latch the way they always did before she forced it open. Inside lay fragments of a life long gone, a faded photograph of her husband in uniform, his jaw set with pride, a silver locket he had given her on their wedding day, and at the bottom, a letter, creased, yellow, the ink smudged by tears and time. It was signed in a name she had sworn never to read again. Elias, her husband's brother. His shadow, his curse. The memory of Elias. She could still see him as if he stood before her now. Tall, sharp-eyed, with a smile that hid knives behind it. Where her husband had been steady, Elias had been reckless. Where her husband had chosen honor, Elias had chosen power. The three of them had once shared the same table, the same bread, the same laughter that echoed across these fields. But it hadn't lasted. She remembered the night Elias came with his men, faces masked, rifles raised. She remembered her husband pushing her behind him as the gunfire cracked. She remembered the red bloom across his chest, his body crumpling into the dirt, her screams swallowed by the roar of horses fleeing into the dark, and she remembered Elias's eyes as he rode away, firelight painting them with madness. "You'll thank me one day," he had shouted, "when everything you love belongs to me." But it never did. Not the land, not her, only the silence remained. The children's truth. The widow's hand trembled as she pressed the letter shut and lowered the chest lid. She turned and walked toward the children's room. Her boots struck the floor like the toll of a funeral bell. She opened the door. 3 small forms stirred. The sacks were still over their heads, though one had slipped halfway, revealing a pair of watchful eyes glinting in the half-light. The boy from the night before, the one who had whispered her name. He sat up slowly, his voice rasping. "He told us about you, about this place. He said if the world ever turned on us, we were to find you." Her jaw tightened. "Your father was a liar." The boy shook his head, his hair dark and matted beneath the burlap. "He said you hated him, but you wouldn't hate us. He said you would understand." Her breath sharpened, but she said nothing. Another child stirred, a girl, smaller, her sack tilting as she raised her face. Her voice was softer, like a ghost carried on the wind. "Are we safe here?" The words carved into the widow deeper than any blade. She looked at them, 3 frail bodies bruised by hunger, scarred by neglect, carrying not only their father's sins but the innocence he had tried to bury with them. Safe. The word haunted her. She had built her life on silence, on walls no one could cross, on the ashes of what Elias had burned. And now here were his children, asking the one thing she had not been able to give herself. The weight of choice. She stepped back, leaning against the doorframe, her hands trembling though she forced them still. The house groaned around her as though it too waited for her answer. Her voice came low, rough as gravel. "Why were you at that auction?" The boy's eyes lowered. "He's gone," he said simply. The words fell heavy in the air. "Our father." "He's dead. His men scattered. We were taken, traded, sold. They put the sacks on us so no one would see, so no one would care." The widow closed her eyes. For years she had dreamed of Elias's death, dreamed of the day his shadow would no longer hang over her land. She had imagined relief, freedom. But there was no freedom in this. Only 3 orphans chained to his ghost. She turned sharply, striding to the table in the main room. Her hands gripped the edge, knuckles white. Rage boiled beneath her skin, but not rage at them, rage at him, at the way he had poisoned even the silence of her house. Behind her, small footsteps followed. The boy had risen, his sack half torn, his face pale in the morning light. "He said you were strong," he whispered. "He said if anyone could keep us alive, it was you." The widow spun, her voice like a whip. "Do not speak of him in my house." The boy flinched but did not retreat. His chin lifted, trembling but defiant. "Then don't do it for him. Do it for us." The word struck her harder than a bullet. For us, her chest ached. For the first time in years, she felt her husband's presence, his hand on hers, his steady voice reminding her of the promises they had made to build a life worth protecting. She looked at the boy, at the girl, at the smallest one still silent and hidden beneath the burlap. They were not Elias. They were children. And without her they had nothing, the dawn decision. The widow's shoulders sagged. The fire in her chest dimmed into something heavier, something she could not name. She stepped forward, her hands reaching, not to strike, not to tear away the sacks, but to rest gently on the boy's head. Her voice, when it came, was soft and bitter, a prayer wrapped in ash. "You do not know what it means to stay here. This house is not safe. I am not safe. Everything around me burns." The boy's eyes glistened, but he did not look away. "Then we'll burn with you." Her breath caught. Her hand shook as it lingered on his hair. She saw not Elias in him, but something else, something unbroken. Slowly she pulled the sack from his head, then from the girl's, then from the smallest one. Faces emerged, thin, tired, but alive. Faces that carried shadows of Elias, yes, but also echoes of something purer. The widow stepped back, staring at them as if seeing them for the first time. The choice pressed down on her like the sky itself. Send them away and bury the past once more. Or keep them, and let the past grow roots she could never tear out. Her hands clenched, her voice a whisper not meant for them but for the ghost of her husband. "What would you have me do?" The wind answered through the cracks in the house. The children waited, eyes wide, breaths held, and the widow knew, though her heart rebelled, though her soul trembled, that her decision would not be made tomorrow. It was made now, in this breath, in this silence, in this house that would never be empty again. The house groaned in the storm's breath. Shutters beat against the walls like angry fists, and rain clawed at the roof until water bled through the cracks. The widow's cabin, once only wood and nails, now felt like a vessel carrying ghosts across a black sea. Inside, lantern light wavered across trembling faces. The three children sat huddled on the floor, the burlap sacks long gone, their eyes wide with the fear of everything that had been done to them, and everything that was yet to come. The widow stood by the fire. Its flame painted her veil with flickers of orange, though she never lifted it. Her hands were pressed against the mantel, knuckles white. Her chest rose and fell, but no sound escaped her lips. For hours she had remained like that, a shadow of grief carved into wood and silence. Then, the voice came. Small, fragile, barely louder than the crack of rain. Abigail. The name fell like a stone into the silence. The widow's hands loosened. Her back stiffened. No one had spoken her name in years, not in public, not in private. She had buried it with her husband, buried it with the child she never bore, buried it with the woman she once was. Her head turned slowly. The smallest of the orphans, the girl with ash in her hair and eyes too old for her years, had spoken it. "Abigail," she said again. And this time there was no doubt. She knew the name. The widow's heart thundered, a drumbeat of ghosts. She stepped forward, her boots scraping the wooden floor, until she stood over the girl. "Say it again." Her voice was sharp, almost cruel, but beneath it ran the current of desperation. The girl looked up, lips trembling, then whispered, "Abigail." "Mama told me that name. She told me before they took her away." The widow's breath caught. The world seemed to tilt. Memories poured back, nights of laughter, a woman's voice, promises made in whispers, and a blood-soaked field where those promises had been torn apart. Her knees gave out, and she fell before the child. With shaking hands, she grasped the girl's shoulders. The veil slid from her head, revealing a face lined with years of sorrow. "Who was your mother?" she demanded, though part of her already knew. The girl's eyes filled with tears. She said she was your sister." The words shattered the air like gunfire. The storm outside seemed to roar louder, as if the sky itself had heard the truth. The widow staggered back, her hands covering her mouth. A sound escaped her, a sound no one had heard in years. A cry. Not of anger, not of fury, but of loss. The kind of cry that came from the marrow, from the soul, from a wound that could never heal. Her sister. Her blood gone, and in her place, this child. This fragile piece of family carried through fire and chains. The widow rose, trembling, her grief twisting into something sharper, harder. She turned toward the window, where lightning flashed and revealed the distant silhouette of the town. "Who sold you?" she asked, her voice a rasp of iron. The children hesitated, afraid to speak. But the boy, the oldest, finally lifted his chin. His voice cracked, but it carried the weight of truth. "They called him Merrick. He took us after the raid. He said no one would ever want us, but he could make a coin off our backs. The name tasted of poison." Abigail knew it. Everyone did. Merrick, a man who wore the town like a cloak, whose money bought silence, whose cruelty was whispered about but never punished. A man who fed on the helpless. Abigail's fists clenched. For years she had let grief chain her to the shadows. But now her grief had a name. Her sorrow had a target. Her vengeance had a face. She moved across the room, pulling a chest from beneath her bed. With a screech of old wood it opened, revealing relics of a life she had sworn never to touch again. Inside lay her husband's revolver. The metal glistened like a memory, heavy and cold. She lifted it, the weight both familiar and unbearable. Beneath it, a rifle wrapped in oiled cloth, a knife dulled by time, and a badge, rusted, broken, but once belonging to a man of law. The children watched in silence as she armed herself, as though they were witnessing the birth of someone entirely new, or perhaps the return of someone the world had tried to bury. Abigail's veil fell to the floor. Her eyes burned with the fury of storms, and when she spoke, it was no longer the voice of a lonely widow. It was the voice of vengeance. "Stay here. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me." The girl's voice broke. "You'll come back, won't you?" Abigail knelt, pressing her forehead against the child's. "I've already lost too much. I won't lose you." Then she rose, her revolver in hand, and stepped into the storm. The night swallowed her. Rain plastered her hair against her face, thunder rolled like war drums, and every step she took toward town felt like walking into hell. But she did not waver. By the time she reached the edge of the main street, the storm had silenced the town. Windows were dark, doors bolted. Only the saloon burned with light, music bleeding through its walls, laughter rolling out like mockery. She pushed through its doors. The piano stopped. Cards froze mid-air. Every head turned. And at the back of the room, Merrick looked up from his whiskey, his smirk curdling into confusion. "Abigail," he drawled, as though the name were a ghost. "Well, I'll be damned. Didn't think you had it in you to show your face again." Abigail raised the revolver. Her voice cut through the silence. "You took my sister. You sold her children. And for that, Merrick, you're already dead." The saloon erupted. Men scrambled for cover. Merrick reached for his gun, but the storm outside seemed to strike with her hand. Thunder cracked. Lightning flared. And in the chaos, the lonely widow's vengeance rang out. A shot that carried years of grief, years of silence, years of rage. The echo rolled across the town, louder than thunder, sharper than rain. And when it faded, everyone knew the truth. The widow was no longer lonely. She was wrath itself, and somewhere, far from the saloon, in a small cabin on the hill, 3 children huddled close. When the storm finally eased, they knew she would return, not as the woman who had bought them like shadows, but as the woman who had given them back their names. And in the hush of that night, the smallest girl whispered once more. Abigail, a name once buried. A name reborn. A name carried forward not in sorrow but in fire.